Welcome to the One-on-One Podcast with your host, Juan Ayala.
Episode of the One-on-One Podcast. I'm your host as always. Make sure to follow the show on social media at the One-on-One Podcast on pretty much all social media platforms. Make sure to check out the Patreon, patreon.com/the One-on-One Podcast, www.tjojp.com. All the links down in the description. And today, joining us for the very first time, Larry Hancock. Sir, how are you? It's a pleasure to meet you.
I'm good. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Can you let people know where they can find you, Larry, if this is the first time they've heard about you, and where they can find your book, which we will be covering today, The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah, probably the best way to see all my works, and I've done some 12, 14 books over the last few years, is on Amazon's author page. So just look for Larry Hancock books on Amazon. The books are available. The Oswald Puzzle is available pretty much everywhere, including Walmart's website, which is kind of interesting. So you can find it anywhere. But the other place to see what I'm doing is I have a blog on WordPress. So it's Larry Hancock and WordPress. Do a search for that and you'll find me.
Awesome. And I'll post the links down in the description after the show so people can check it out and check out the book. I was telling you, I haven't talked about the JFK assassination on my show because it's one of those conspiracies, because it is a conspiracy. I mean, at the end of the day, that the governmental, hey, the CIA and the FBI both investigated that the CIA and the FBI had no wrongdoing, so we're good to go, like that sort of thing. I don't find that interesting. What I find interesting is what happens after the fact. So we have the event, which was obviously the JFK assassination, that we know for a fact happened, right? He was taken out. Now, the whole conspiracy is who actually did it? How did he pull it off? Motivations as to why he would do it, right? And of course, the patsy or the fall guy that took the hit for this, which we will never truly know the actual truth, is Lee Harvey Oswald. How many years, Larry, have you been at it researching the JFK assassination and topics related to this?
I started in the mid-'90s, so over 30 years on JFK, but not just JFK, basically political actions in the 60s and early 70s, whether it's JFK, MLK, RFK. I've written on all of them, plus basically the national security. That's my wheelhouse, national security activities during the Cold War. So yeah, over 3 decades. And as you say, also down lots of rabbit holes. If there were rabbit holes to be found, I fell in them.
Is there any in particular that you enjoy the most, Larry?
I would say researching and writing about real American history. Deniable operations, covert activities, and partially because we know a lot about that now. I mean, everybody says you're only going to know what really happened like 50 years after the fact. History is never immediate, right? Historians write about the past. And I'm a history buff. I'm a document buff. So it's satisfying to go back to something like Vietnam or something like the Tonkin Gulf, things that were very real to me. That's my period of time, and find out now what was really happening that we didn't know at the time. So I would say that's probably the most satisfying for me, especially when you find it and find proof of it in the records.
So it's safe to say that aliens didn't take JFK out? Would you?
I'm pretty good on no on that one. Yeah, no on that one. And it wasn't the relatives of the crew of the Thresher submarine that blamed him for that. And yeah, there are a few others like that. Yep. Out of all of those, we can write at least some off.
How has this research, putting in so much time, and there are people who, right, There are doctors who dedicate their entire lives to studying one particular field of medicine, historians that, like yourself, that you're studying this niche area. How has researching at least the JFK assassination shaped your worldview, if any at all?
It really has shaped my worldview, and you bring up a very good point, and it's a point that often gets lost in the conspiracy community. And that is, if you study just one piece of history, you tend to become fixated, but all history is situational. All needs context. If you don't know, if I tried to study JFK without knowing how the CIA really operated, I would lose. Or how the FBI operated. You've got to know how they're organized, how they're structured, what their standard operating practices are. So without that kind of context, you go down these rabbit holes and never come back. So for me, that's been really the biggest thing that I've become aware of and learned, is that you can't slice it too finely. It's kind of like painting with too broad a brush. If you do that, you're never going to get the right answer. It's kind of like, again, painting. You got to be able to do broad brush and detail to make it right.
How does someone go about writing a book like this that's very heavy on documents? I want to focus on what the documents and what the facts say from the people who are providing it. And a follow-up question from that, how do you not let your thinking be tainted by the conspiracy realm of things? And how do you not let your mind wander as you're doing this research?
Boy, that is a real challenge. But the first thing, you have to look for what, put it this way, you have to look for what you find, not what you want to find. The thing that I'm always most pleased about is if I'm finding something that I didn't expect, I know I'm on the right track. If I find what I was thinking was there and only that, I'm afraid I'm driving myself. So when I'm actually going down a trail and find something unexpected, I think I'm going in the right direction. And you've got to do that with documents, which means that you have to look at not just one set of documents. For example, I found a lot of things about CIA operations and practices in general looking at State Department documents, because State Department has their version of what's going on. And if they think the CIA is doing something stupid they'll write it down. Same for the CIA versus the state. Same for military intelligence. If you look at multiple sources in the documents describing the same event, it becomes very informative. So you've got to bounce this stuff against each other. You can't just go down one trail. And then that requires a huge amount of document work. Tens of thousands of pages, and learning how to read the documents. One of the things that's been most valuable for us, and you might be surprised, people are surprised, kind of like, well, you've got documents, but how do you read them? And the first thing you've got to do is you've got to be able to crack the names in the documents, the pseudonyms, the aliases, the organizations. If you don't go do your homework and are not able to find that, you won't really even know what you're reading, because it will talk about something going on, but you don't know who conducted it, who they're connected to. Just one of the things that's allowed us to crack a lot of stuff in regard to JFK assassination is being able to basically what we call busting pseudonyms. Find out the names that are used in the documents to describe real people. Who were they and what are their aliases? So we can track them and see who's really involved and what their networks were. Long-winded answer to it's a lot of slogging.
Do you do it by yourself, Larry, or do you have a team that helps you out with this?
Usually I work with, usually just a small group of, say, like half a dozen people that really get to be expert in, how do we read the CIA operations files out of the Cuban branch in Miami? In the whole world, that's a small group of people, maybe a dozen people. And then to pursue any particular line of thought, it's usually 2 or 3 people that really dig in, which was why in many of my books I do it with a co-author. And often the co-author is really the document expert. With the Oswald puzzle, David Boylan is the fellow who had the intensity to essentially construct an organization chart of CIA operations in Miami. Now you got to imagine that. If I talk about slogging for me, it's even more for him. So and we talk with each other. We share information, like on the cryptonym busting. Who ran across it? A real kind of an interesting thing is there that aliens and cryptonyms were done to confuse the Soviets. I mean, they're not done to confuse us in the documents, but they actually get to the point where they confuse the readers. So a CIA officer will pencil in a little annotation going, "Oh, this is really this person, or true name, or whatever." It's kind of like, okay, we got them. And those notes were never supposed to be on the documents, right? Somebody's just trying to help themselves. When you start finding those, you make progress.
So a lot of these documents, it's safe to say they're encoded in some sort of way in case information gets leaked to a foreign power. That way they won't be able to read it. But then at the same time, as a layman, a person who is not in the organization, you can sometimes take things for face value, and then you're led off a completely wrong track.
Yeah, absolutely. If you will make wrong assumptions. You maybe assume it's a different organization. One of the most fascinating things about them is to learn the distribution. Who's getting what information? Who's copied? What offices are what copied? What individuals are what copied? What's happening to the control of the information? In CIA, one of the things that's become very helpful to us in regard to Lee Harvey Oswald is to find out who is getting information on him at various points in times and who it's being withheld from. Compartmentalization can tell you a lot. And what you find out in Oswald's case, in particular, at different points in time, certain parts of the CIA are not telling other parts of the CIA who ask about him. They're holding back information. And there's only one real interpretation for that, and that the organization holding the information is using not him as an agent, but using information about him for some purpose. So even distribution can be informative.
So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but can the documents be trusted, Larry, at all?
Yeah, they can be trusted. Here's the thing is, the documents we're talking about are day-to-day operational documents. People could not do their day job without them. And we know based on them and things that happen next, it's like things that were discussed in the documents did happen. People that discussed, you can reality check the documents. Now, it is true that on occasion, fake documents were created, but usually the strange thing is the fake documents that we have found are generally created outside agencies for some other purpose, that to fool someone. Or we've even, and it's very infrequent, but we've run a couple of cases where someone outside an agency will do a document, know enough to do a good document, and then actually go into the National Archives and plant it. The good news is, though, you can track that down because the National Archives, when doing their job, has a record of all their intake. So they can go back and we work with them. And it's kind of like, did you guys ever really take this document in? Nope. No, we didn't. Aha. A particular case of that is there's a document that circulates about every 3 years. I've seen it like 8 times over the decades. And it's a document saying that Oswald was actually briefed by the Office of Naval Intelligence for going into Russia. And it's supposed to be a correspondence between, like senior people at both agencies. Well, now, first of all, that would never be written down. That's not standard operating practice to write an interagency memo after the assassination to confirm this sort of thing. Doesn't happen. But as it turns out, that document never existed in reality. It was planted to support somebody's book, somebody's story, whatever, but it can be checked. So we have devices to check that sort of thing. And people often ask me, it's like, well, if somebody makes up a series of fake documents, is that illegal? And the interesting thing is, if there's no actual crime involved, no fraud, it's sort of like, if it's not a real government document, there's nothing illegal about circulating it. If it was never classified, never a real document, the FBI can investigate it. And we know instances where the FBI or the Air Force or someone has investigated a document and go, it's bogus. And it's like, well, are you going to prosecute them? Well, it's not a crime because they didn't profit from it. They just used it for self-aggrandizement or promoting themselves or gaining influence. So it's not a crime per se, unless you can prove it really is part of a fraud.
That's actually pretty amazing and kind of scary at the same time, because it's just making me want to trust the government less, because, hey, who's to say? I mean, that just opens up a whole can of worms if you're able to insert information that, hey, it's not a crime technically, and nothing happened. That's crazy, Larry, like how that could happen.
But we can find it. I guess that's the good news. You ask, is it possible? The government does check itself. I mean, I think that's like the FBI can investigate. They will call in document experts. We're at the point, I have friends who are experts enough to say, is the record keeping in this document? Is the serial number right? Look at this document. Is it right or it's wrong? So the government can investigate those sort of things. NARA controls its archives and does a good job. Like I say, it was easy to check that Oswald document. It didn't require a lot of time. It's just like, NARA, this thing is floating around and people are saying it's real. Did you ever hold this document? No. So you have to be cautious about, and frankly, you have to be cautious in the more sensational claims like that. You mentioned earlier, like one of the frauds that I was talking about had to do with the aliens at JFK. I mean,
is there really a document saying that?
There are actually documents saying that the government knew all about alien contact and had alien contact from 1947. It's called the Majestic Series of Documents, and that JFK was going to expose this, and it's a whole thing in and of itself. So, but we've learned how to deal with that sort of thing. But yeah, you bet. I'm sure you thought it was joking, and we're going, it's just a pain in the rear. Another alien JFK thing.
I was kidding. I've heard that before, but I didn't know it was an actual thing. That there's actual documents and an idea that it could happen. And this is how little I've looked into the JFK assassination. And I'm kind of doing it backwards with your book, because it's more on, you focus on more of Lee Harvey Oswald, and you don't really get into the events of JFK, even though you have written about them. And I remember back in, I think I was still in high school, I read one of the many, many books on the magic bullet, I think, at one point, where that, again, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. And I don't ever think I finished it, but again, that's the whole thing. But I want to get because I watched a few of your interviews, and I heard you talk about memory and how memory can be tainted. And right off the bat in the foreword by Rex Bradford, he gets into what the Attorney General wrote the White House, right? The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large. So the public must be, what did it say here? Must be satisfied. Like, hey, this is what we're dishing out. This is what you're going to accept. But I've heard you talk about how memory itself can be tainted very easily. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems that history relies a lot on memory. And then if the people writing that history, if they're doing their due diligence, how you guys are doing double checking and fact checking all these documents, if they're not doing a good job doing that, they weren't there to experience what happened,
There have been a lot of really good studies done on that. And what we learn is, say, the experience of a witness is good it's good until they start talking to other people. If you can catch them within an hour or so after the event, take a statement, get as much detail as you can, you're pretty good. But once they start circulating and talking to other people or listening to the news, they become less and less reliable over time, and they essentially absorb these things. You're talking about gaining the narrative. People can absorb the narrative just like because through media, through people, we have people that firsthand witnesses within the first hour or two who describe things that they later go back and it stuns me. It's sort of like I've seen statements taken later by the Warren Commission that says, well, I heard more than 3 shots, but I must have been wrong. Wait a minute. Why do you think you were wrong? Because the narrative was that there can only be 3 shots. And they actually say this in interviews, like, I know what I saw, but I must have been wrong. Well, no, that's not very useful. I'll give you a classic example of that and how things can go bad, not from the JFK assassination, but from the RFK assassination. There was a young woman named Sandra Serrano, who saw people run away from the RFK assassination, heard them talk about actually laughing about the fact that they'd managed to kill RFK. She became a prime witness in that case. Ultimately, she was disregarded because of a bogus polygraph test that was administered. The line was that she had been brought into a pantry, sat down with other witnesses, and she'd picked this whole story up from other people, and it was not true. The problem was, for the official story, is an assistant DA out of Los Angeles had talked to her within minutes before she ever went anywhere else, and actually ended up writing a number of letters saying she told him exactly what she said later before she could ever have been contaminated by anyone else. And that's you have to be able to parse through that stuff. And they ignored her, and they ignored him. After 2 or 3 letters, he just kind of gave up. And this is an associate DA. But we've also learned in lots of experiments that, for example, a classroom of students, a professor can perform and has perform experiments in a psychology class of having something unexpected happen at the front of the room, in front of the whole class. Then he has them write down what they saw that day. Open up that thing at the end of or have them write down at the end of the semester what they recall seeing. Open up their letters, and they're going, well, I must have made a mistake when I write the bottom line is interviewing witnesses on aspects of detail of an event, weeks, months, years after the fact, is very problematic and just gets you in trouble. I'm surprised now that the new congressional committee on disclosure is going to Dallas to interview witnesses. It's way too late. If you go back to their first day statements, take those. You don't interview them now. You're going to get overlays.
They really went back, because one of the main things I saw keeping up with the news is that I think Trump unclassified a ton of new documents. Have you had a chance to look through those? Have your colleagues looked through those? Is there any new information that would perhaps change the outcome of this book at all? Or is there any new revelation that has come from that at all?
Well, what has happened is he wrote a directive that literally said, in the interest of disclosure, within 15 days, I'm appointing a team under the Director of National Intelligence to come up with a plan to release documents. Supposedly, they submitted it to the White House. We've seen nothing about it. Within 45 days, there was to be a plan to address MLK. The first plan was just JFK, MLK and RFK. We've seen nothing of either of those. We've seen no due documents. And one of the troubling things is if you look at the fine print in that directive, it also says that the order will not override the authorities of the agencies involved, which would still leave them the option of redacting information. It doesn't require them to unredact anything that's already been released, which is okay. What I really want is all the black off the stuff I can already see, because I know that's what I need. It doesn't. So far, it really hasn't led to anything concrete. Hopefully, there are people that I know, and we're reaching out to this group to say, we know where to look, we know what to look for, and we actually know important things that have been withheld. Let us help you. So far, no response yet. So no, we've not seen anything new yet. Separately, this Congressional Committee on Disclosure is going to start holding hearings on a whole suite of subjects. But all that's been announced so far is literally that they're going to Dallas and interview witnesses. And my expertise would literally say, no, there are better things that you could be doing with your time. I've talked to most of those people myself years ago. So, lots of us have. That's already on record. And I still wouldn't consider it good as compared to the first day statements. See what they said on TV that day and use that.
You see how this could fuel more conspiracy, Larry, where it's kind of dodgy, very secretive. What are your thoughts on maybe someone who is very influential that had a hand in this conspiracy, because that's what it is, right? They're conspiring against JFK. I'm sure that there are various reasons one could come up with to want to take out a political figure like that, right? Ideological differences, political differences. Anyone can talk crap about a political person for whatever reason. Now, to actually act on something like this takes it to a whole nother level, right? But why the secrecy? Do you think that maybe there's somebody who's still alive who had like a hand in it, who was influential, and they don't want them to know? And will we see it in our lifetimes?
I don't think the secrecy has anything to do with that, strangely enough. From what I know on the road that I have gone down, to some extent, I think the people that were involved that are still living were it was a very personal act they considered to be patriotic. I don't think they would be embarrassed by it. They would be actionable. Yeah, that's another story, but that's not the issue. The issue is the fact that at the time, during a 12-month period, agencies and the president of the time, the president acted to preempt an investigation of conspiracy. We know that. You saw some of that in the first part of the book, because we tried to revisit a little bit of why we know that was so egregious. Why we can say factually that the investigation wasn't done that should be done. It was focused entirely on Oswald as a lone nut, even though no motive could be found. And they had to cherry pick that positioning. But there were agencies that were involved with Oswald, that were doing operations built around Oswald, that would not want it's embarrassing. I mean, it's compromise. It's not a big deal now. It really shouldn't be a big deal now with what we know about covert and deniable operations for the last 60 years. But still, there would be people that would consider it, embarrassing. And quite frankly, these people did not do their duty. They did not do their duty in sharing information. The FBI didn't reveal everything it really had. We know the FBI actually destroyed a couple of documents relating their contacts with Oswald. We know that the CIA actually investigated and lied about investigating and said, no, we didn't do it. Cuban connections, connections to their people, to anti-Castro people, to Cuban operatives. They did that investigation because they had leads that said that could have been in play. But they didn't report that to anybody. And when asked, they said, no, we never touched it. Investigating the assassination was the Warren Commission. Now, you talked earlier about trust. At the time, if we'd have known that in 1965 or 1970, it would have accrued a lot of distrust. Can you trust agencies to disclose their own operations? And I think they're still following on that rule. We have to trust our agencies, so we don't want them to embarrass themselves. I think this is more about trust and embarrassment than anything else. Is there anyone that's going to suffer from disclosing that information after 60, 70 years? I don't think so. The agencies might suffer.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And then obviously that would cascade towards public opinion towards them and towards the people. And obviously they can't have that happening. But there seems to be a pattern of, assassinations or attempts where they've had previous contact with the suspect, right? The latest one that really, I was going to ask you, if this were to happen today, do you think somebody could have gotten away with it? Do you think Lee Harvey Oswald would have gotten away with it in today's terms? And I think he would have done it and would have still got caught, because if you look at the most recent one, right, with Trump, I mean, what really came of that? And it's few and far between the assassinations and attempts that have happened throughout history, right? Abraham Lincoln, all these other guys. You can even put MLK in there. But it always seems like as soon as it happens, boom, here's the guy. We got it solved. And then something happens to him where, hey, dead men tell no tales, right?
Yeah. I asked that same question myself. It's kind of like, is the JFK in terms of the national response, the establishment response, if you will. That's what we called it when I was younger, the establishment. Okay, I know there are new names for it, but the establishment response is always the same. And I went back and I did a book called Surprise Attack, literally to tackle that question. What do you expect after an event of national consequence, whether it's an assassination, assassination attempt, something historical like the attack on the Liberty or the Pueblo, both of, one of which really started the Vietnam War to a higher level. What happens? And the point is the rush. There's always a rush by any administration, doesn't matter what party, what politics, whatever. The knee-jerk reaction is always to seize the narrative and to essentially dim the consequences. Like, we don't want people going off half-cocked. Johnson did not want people, Oswald's associated with Cuba and as a Castro supporter. Castro did it, we need to invade, right? No, if you're in charge, you don't want those kind of reactions. If you're, we have an instance in the MLK assassination of where the evening of the attack, the Attorney General and the head of the FBI went on the air and said, we know who did it. It was one person. There's no conspiracy, and it had nothing to do with race. Now, everybody, I was there. It's like, no, we don't. But why did they say that when they knew nobody would believe it? There's this temptation to always seize the narrative. And once you seize the narrative, how do you escape from it? How do you go back and really investigate it after you've told I'm not even sure that there's evil intent. It's just like there's this temptation, you do it, and then how do you recover? Ignore what I told you, trust me next time. Mm-hmm. It's not going to work well. I think they trap themselves each and every time. And do we hear more about it, even if there's investigation? We don't hear anything about it other than what's going to end up supporting that original narrative, because otherwise you lose trust. And nobody, Republican, Democrat, whatever, whoever's in administration always wants trust. Now, unfortunately, they tend to lose it because of just those things. But, that's human behavior. That's another story entirely.
So speaking of trusting the narrative and taking their word for it, what are some of the more common misconceptions about Oswald? Since this book does focus on Oswald the most, one of the ones that I fell for, which apparently there's no evidence for, is that he was a CIA asset. Well, what are some of the more common ones that most people probably believe that turns out to be bullshit?
Well, there's two. It's kind of like there's two limited, very focused views of Oswald. The Warren Commission wanted you to see him as asocial or antisocial, no interreactions with people, no friends, a loner, violent, a radical activist. This guy's a radical communist. None of that's true. And how do we know that's not true? We know it by looking at the long pattern, like several years of Oswald's dialogues, friends, writings. By 1963, he was writing a lot of monographs and his worldview. He was talking to people, and he would tell people, for example, he thought Kennedy was the person who could talk with Khrushchev and dial down the Cold War, resolve the issue of possible nuclear warfare. Kennedy's even talking to them about going to the moon with the Russians, a joint program. You can, and with his friends. I mean, this is supposedly the Warren Commission wants to see you as antisocial and a loner. And he's got friends in the military, friends in Russia, even. He's dating in Russia. He proposes, turned down, proposes again, gets married, has 2 children, and so this is a person who's also in media a lot, TV and radio in New Orleans. And when they brought him on, and it's actually a radio host tried to get him to speak out against JFK over Cuba, Oswald pulled back and said, basically, no, it's not President Kennedy. It's years of administration policy towards Cuba that I oppose. There's no reason that we should not have a relation. So, if you look at all that detail, you see that the Warren Commission was cherry picking. Now, on the other hand, us conspiracy folks have our own blame to carry because we have tended to want to simplify matters and make Oswald a tool of the bad guys, whoever the bad guys were. I mean, that ranges from him being some kind of a contract killer, like just taking an assignment from the mob, like, okay, somebody decided to pick Oswald to go shoot the president, or being a tool of the CIA, whatever. But when you study his personality and his beliefs, and he's very much an idealist, more of an idealist in politics than you could imagine, and more practically took orders from nobody. This is a guy who in the Marine Corps, he gets the classic thing in barracks because he's not clean enough and he gets soaped down. Okay, if you've been in the military, you might know what that, it's not pretty. He ends up, doesn't like the duties he's getting assigned, too much KP. He confronts an NCO in a club and throws a drink on the NCO. This is not a guy, he's not passive. If he feels he's being picked on, he will speak out, but he's not violent. He's just not passive. But the conspiracy has tended to take him as an order taker, and have moved him from taking totally different sets of orders to multiple groups over a period of time, which is totally out of character for Oswald, who Oswald is the only one I know who ever actually conducted a strike in a Soviet factory and got his boss into trouble because he didn't like the bureaucracy. So he said he was just going to stop going to meetings. And it's like, oh, that's the Oswald I know. This is not the Oswald that you're just going to call up and say, oh, assassinate the president, and he'll just toddle off and do it.
So he seemed like pretty much a regular guy, clean-cut guy that was just trying to survive. Are you familiar at all? Maybe we can get a little conspiratorial, Larry, where the Catcher in the Rye connection with Oswald allegedly was his favorite book. Is there any evidence to prove that?
No, I would say there's no evidence to prove that. And I would offer up the other, in contrast to Catcher in the Rye, if you want to get into Oswald's reading material, which we know a lot about from his library cards, and he's a different person. I would step back and say not the Catcher in the Rye image, but he's a guy that I knew in 1968. He's one of his best friends in 63 called him a proto-hippie. He's a political idealist. In one extent, he's like socialism, parts of socialism. He likes parts of capitalism. He wrote a monograph about how you bring the two together. Yes, you have healthcare, you have education, but you need this for capitalism, he's that kind of guy, and he will speak out on his beliefs. He's not quiet. As a teenager, he would challenge his friends' parents in the barracks. He's going to be the oddball. I've talked with Marines who said, yeah, we had guys like that in the early 60s and late 50s. They were just characters. And in 1968, it would be the guy I was standing by it, said, okay, let's go occupy the Student Union building. And I would go, so what is that going to accomplish? and he would go, "I know, but it'll be fun." Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to make him passive. He was.
Just want to remind everyone, make sure to check out the show on Patreon, patreon.com/the One-on-One podcast. I constantly get emails. Oh, only one episode a week. Yeah, one episode a week for the public, but for as little as $5 a month, you can get up to 2, sometimes 3, sometimes one episode per day on the Patreon, as well as on the YouTube channel as a member for as little as $5. And there's also on the Patreon over 250 episodes only found on there. There's an extensive backlog of episodes. So check that out. If for those interested, for those asking, make sure to follow the show on YouTube, One-on-One Podcast. Also, One-on-One Media. I am going live every Tuesday on there streaming. I also go live on twitch.tv/One-on-One Podcast. So make sure to check me out on there Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern. And make sure to get your copy of the Occultus Mundi Homunculus Owner's Manual, all that good stuff at tjojp.com. Can pick up your copies there or go over to the Ko-Fi. I'm on Facebook, Twitch, Kick, Rumble, all that good stuff. You know where to find it. And enjoy this episode.
He was an average guy in a way, but he was very unique in other ways. Very intelligent, extremely well read. His officers, Marine officers, said that he would discuss geopolitics with them at their level. And this one guy had been a graduate of the Foreign Services at Georgetown. So Oswald was different. I guess I wouldn't call him an average guy, but he's not average in a necessarily an evil sense. He's just not your average guy. The Marine officer said, look, in training, the other guys are just worried about when the first leave is going to be, where to find the bars and the girls. And Oswald is in his bunk reading. He's not like the other Marines.
So would the sleeper cell or Manchurian candidate theory be out the window? Because that's one that you hear a lot about, where, again, this Catcher in the Rye, where he was programmed to kill, and they gave him the string of words that made him snap. Because if you are convicted, which he was never technically convicted, is that correct? And they never actually
Correct.
Convicted him. If you have the cameras on you, obviously he said he was a patsy. Have you been able to decipher that? What exactly he meant by that?
Yeah, and we deal a lot with that in the book, in the latter part of the book, as to what he was talking. Literally, actually, the full statement he made was, I don't know what's going on. They haven't told me what I've done. I've been arrested because I worked in that building, the school book depository. I did work in that building, and I was in Russia. And because I was in Russia, they're going to make me a patsy. It was all about his past. And literally, we maintain in the book that Oswald had no idea. He had a totally different agenda about what was going to happen on November 22nd. He was following his own agenda that had nothing to do with JFK, and he had no idea how he'd been framed. One of the things it has to be pointed out is the police had him in custody for almost 48 hours. They never showed him the rifle that they took into evidence and said, Lee, is this your rifle? This used to kill the president. Is this not your rifle? Never asked him that question. They never showed him the bag that was represented that he used to carry it into the depository and said, did you make this? Did you bring this morning? Never showed him that. They did show the bag to the guy who drove him to work, who under polygraph exam said, no, that's not the bag he took to work. It was a little bag. It was like a sandwich bag. It's not that bag. And they showed him the real bag. They did not show Oswald the real bag. Some of this stuff is so stupid, it's hard to follow. And if you don't know that sort of thing, the evidence looks a lot better than it really was, in fact. But no, I will say another thing that we do is look very closely at his behavior after being taken into custody. Oswald never, when he did something radical, like going to Russia, wants to see what it's like in Russia, when he's leafleting in New Orleans and gets into fight, he's never quiet. He will say why he did it, and what he believes and what's going on. He will take credit for it. Every opportunity to do that in Dallas after the assassination, he leaves no notes, nothing, like no claims, no agendas, totally denies everything, tells his brother and his family that that they're making this up. There's no evidence. Don't worry about it. It's okay. His main concern with his wife is, did you get the baby the shoes she needs? Did you get June the new shoes? We've got to take care of the family through this. We feel he had no idea how he had been framed and how he had been set up.
Larry, could that have been code that he was talking in when he was saying all those things? I'm guessing this was in letters to his wife. Could that have been code maybe?
Oh, that was actually personal. That was actually in-person stuff. One of the answers to that question, and that's a good question that we look at from an historical standpoint, is continuity. Is this the way Oswald always talked? Is this the language that, is this consistent? Is there continuity there, or is it an anomaly? Now, there are anomalies in his behavior on November 22nd, and in the book we offer an explanation for those, what he thought was going to happen. But one of the big keys to this is these expressions and this terminology with his wife, with his family, was very consistent. It was the sort of thing that he had been talking about 2 weeks before, a week before. People had heard him talking that way. He had visited his wife the night before, discussing getting the family back together. In fact, one of the reasons he went to talk to his wife was he was tired of visiting. She was had just had a baby, staying with the Paynes. He wanted to get them back together. Now, if you want a dose of reality, this tells you that this is real and not something coded, because what he asked her, I'm tired of this. I want to get the family together. I want to move you into an apartment tomorrow. I want to come back immediately. And what she said, and as a matter of record, is, look, I got a brand new baby. I got a small child. I'm staying with a lady who has a washing machine. You know how many diapers we're going to be dealing with for the next few weeks. Tell you what, you keep your job, save some money, get an apartment with a washing machine, and we'll talk after Christmas. That's real world stuff. That's not code. That is, okay. And also, so he's going to face a dilemma. We talk about he had a choice. The reason he went to see her is he had a choice. He had a choice of doing something he'd been wanting to do for some months, which was going to Cuba, or thinking he was going to Cuba, or moving them back together. And when she said, let's put it on hold, we think he went one particular way. So to answer your question, no, I don't think there's any code. I think it's very real world. I think we've got some real history.
My conspiratorial mind sometimes bleeds through, Larry, and I just can't help but look at it from a different perspective. Maybe they were speaking in code or something, right? Because you just hear so many things. And how you said earlier that conspiracy heads, they want to kind of sort of simplify thing and kind of just ram it all down. It's like, hey, this was it, that's that. But this is such a complex story when you really come to think about it. And I wanted to get into maybe, where some of these things come from, as far as, hey, he was a CIA asset, he was a sleeper cell, he was a Manchurian candidate, blah, 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 all these things. What are your thoughts on the James Files guy? Because he was one of the ones that I'll be honest, he has a very compelling story. Like, he is telling everything, but then he's telling things a little bit too good, almost like he's telling a story and wanting to take credit for essentially, one of the, I don't want to say one of the greatest events of history, but one of the most infamous events within history, because they took out a president, and this guy's telling you about how many cigarettes he smoked and how he left the bullet casing on top of the fence, and he's making this whole spectacle out of it. Are these people planted to spread misinformation, or what's his deal, and what are your thoughts on him?
I can give you that's one of the rabbit holes, and I could give you 2 or 3 rabbit holes like that took me 2 or 3 years. Yes, did I buy the James Files VHS videotape the moment it was available? Yes, I did. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Not a day. I've been suckered way too much. We'll look at that side of the expense report. It's like, how much money did you spend on what? But long term, the thing is, I came to know two people. One is the person who took the James Files story to the media. And I came to know him over time. And he ultimately recanted and explained in detail how he had been had by Files and what Files' motive was. I was good friends with another lady who's deeply into assassination research for years, who had been in correspondence not only with Files, but with several women who were Files' pen pals in prison. Files, you would not know it from just his book and from what you're talking about. He was a long time, quite frankly, he's bored. He's in for decades, right? He's got a long thing to serve. He needs something to occupy himself. He becomes a pen pal with lots of women, gets engaged to several of them, actually marries one of them and gets conjugal visits. Okay. All right. That's that side of the ledger. He and my friend is corresponding to multiple of these women at the same time because they're telling her what's going on with Files in her life. The other fellow is telling me how he talked with the FBI agent that brought Files to him, that kind of surfaced Files' story. Files convinced him about it, and this guy bought into it. Actually, Files' story was sold twice to different people for different amounts of money, and taken to market twice by different accounts. These people gave me a lot of insight because they tried to, first of all, they had to verify Files at one level, like the FBI guy had, and then they dug deeper. And it was only after they dug deeper that they started to see it falling apart. And one of the things that Files lied about, many things that were provable when you started digging. It sounds great up here, but one of the things that really exposed him was the fact that he constantly said he knew nothing about the Kennedy assassination. And he had no way of knowing anything about the Kennedy assassination. Well, as it turns out, the prison library had a series of books on the Kennedy assassination. And there's nothing that James Files said that couldn't be found in those JFK early books. So he did have source material. Now, part of his story, was he part of the Chicago mob? Absolutely. But there have been a whole host of people, not a host, that's an exaggeration. There have been 8 or 9 people like this who have parlayed parts of their past into stories for their own purposes. Sometimes they were political purposes, sometimes like for Files started writing poems. He started writing poems about the Kennedy assassination and how he was a good guy in the Kennedy assassination. He wrote songs. But in any event, long story short, no, Files did not prove to be credible in the long run, as many of these people did not. I think a couple of them, I'm not going to condemn them because I think they might be very sincere with their story, and their story came to be for certain personal reasons. We have to deal with that. But I'll have to admit, only by seeing the evolution of a lot of these stories over the decades and knowing people and contacting people on the inside of the stories, it's the only way that, I was able to deal with the stories, because they all look sound on a certain level because there's always a certain amount of truth. It's kind of like standard disinformation. Disinformation doesn't work unless there's some element of truth in it.
No, absolutely. And it always seems like with a lot of these big stories, like I said, they have people who, with disclosure and with everything else that are there to kind of steer, how you said, I forgot what you called it earlier, where they take the initiative to take the narrative over. And it's like, it just muddies the waters up even more because this guy, he's, linking the CIA. He said he was hanging out with Harvey Oswald, the day prior to that, they're driving around, blah, blah, blah. And it makes me think of, I believe it was Jack Ruby when they're is it like an interview or something, or they're filming him and he's like, we're never going to know the truth right? The truth will never see something, I'm paraphrasing, see the light of day or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's very enigmatic. That's a very mysterious thing to say. And asking, oh, why not? It's like, because does it contain higher people? Does it involve higher people? And he says, yes. You know, almost like, again, this grand conspiracy. And one can only think, Larry, how far up the line does it go?
Well, and with Jack Ruby, having spent a much longer amount of time on Jack Ruby than James Files, you're getting much closer to the truth. Yeah. So just to kind of push past that, yes, Jack Ruby is part of the conspiracy. He was brought into the conspiracy by Johnny Roselli. He started out with a very low-level role, and then after Oswald was captured, which was not part of the plan, he was given a totally new role, and things become much more complex. So, agreed. Some of the stories don't just have a nugget of truth; they do have truth in them, and you've got to deal with them. So I don't want to pretend, there is a conspiracy there and you have to track it down, and certain people do have elements of the truth. Ruby's truth actually emerges through analysis of Ruby doing things and behaving in ways that make no sense unless he was actually associated with the conspiracy. Over some 72 hours before and after the assassination itself. I spent an agonizing amount of detail looking at microanalysis of his movements, of his phone calls, of his behaviors, and there's certainly a case to be made for his involvement. His prior, Jack Ruby, most people would probably shocked to know that he was so deeply into Cuban gun running and during the revolution that he was actually used by the FBI for a period of over a year as a provisional criminal informant. They provided him equipment for tape recordings. It's very likely that his contribution to that investigation was used in the conviction of a gun running effort by a fellow out of Houston named McCowan. Long story there, but Jack Ruby had part of the real story. He certainly didn't have the whole story. He just knew a little bit of it. But he was very dangerous, which is why basically what happened to him. He was turned into an unreliable source, and we won't get too far into it. But no, I do not think the visit by Jolly West, who is the CIA LSD specialist, to Ruby in jail on multiple occasions, and the true observable fact that Ruby became more and more irrational after those visits, up to the comment that you're talking about, is sheer circumstance.
Wait.
So, yeah, I can do conspiracy, honest.
That's wild. See, this is why you're the expert, because I had no idea about that. But that's pretty crazy. That again, we're dipping into the conspiracy realm of things. How do you think it would have? Because this seems like such a clear-cut case. It's so convenient. Right, they get Lee Harvey Oswald. He's coming out. Where was he coming out of? A police station or something or other? And then boom, Jack Ruby gets him, and that's all she wrote.
Yeah, that was clear cut. And anybody, and we know so much detail about it. It was so suspicious. The biggest problem the Warren Commission had, honestly, with the whole suppression of information was Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission, surprisingly enough, other than the FBI, who they didn't trust, and we know that from their own documents, had only 2 investigators. Those 2 investigators were sent to Dallas to investigate Ruby and his connections to the police, his other connections. They were all over Ruby, especially his crime connections, in his history with people like Roselli and with these other things. The Warren Commission actually dismissed them because they were pointing towards some connections with the police and Ruby that might have resulted in Oswald's death that nobody wanted to see. They dismissed them. Those 2 guys said, okay, we'll leave, we'll resign, actually, we'll go away, but we want a promise from you that when you come down to Dallas to question Jack, we got the right questions. You've got to call us back and let us participate. The Warren Commission did not call them back. Ruby was Ruby could have unraveled at least one part of the conspiracy, and was very dangerous. And people that knew that were very dangerous. People that knew. I mean, you look at the fact, and this is hard to take. If you want something that's hard to take, is up to a certain point in the day of the assassination, Rufy is chipper, he's cheerful, he's fine, he's good. Everybody that meets him, it's the same old Jack Ruby. Right after the assassination, he goes back to his club. He's told he's gotten several calls from somebody unnamed. Then he makes a call, and there are a couple of calls exchanged with a guy in L.A. who's a known contact of John Roselli within his circuit. And after that, Jack falls apart. He goes to his sister's and he starts throwing up. And from then on, over the weekend, he's a totally changed person. The obvious reason, he's been told that what he was doing, his role has changed. It's kind of like, Jack, you know what the game is like. Yeah, you were locating some dirty cops for us to use. You're a good field guy. You're not minor role. It's okay. You got paid some money. We even know his banker said he came into some money. Okay. But you know what the rules are, right, Jack? You either do this, we've got a loose end that wasn't supposed to be there. You take care of it, or your sister. Jack, you love your sister, right, Jack? You know what's going to happen if you don't do this. And that's what happened. He had no choice. Even afterwards, when you talk about motive, Oswald had no motive. Ruby had no motive for killing Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's supposed to be spontaneous, right? But that's not going to fly. It's just he didn't even go see the motorcade, right? It's not like he's a fan of JFK. He's not like, so he didn't even go see the motorcade. But suddenly he's concerned enough to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. So they asked him what his motive was. He said, "Well, I really wanted to make sure that Jackie didn't have to come back to Dallas for trial." Jack is not known for being a sympathetic, Jack is the guy who bounces people out of his club, kicks people. He's not known for being a sympathetic individual, or ever having talked about Jackie Kennedy or Jack Kennedy. Later on, we found out his lawyer gave him that motive, and his lawyer admitted, you got to have something to tell people, Jack. I can't just go to court without you. Here, try this.
To sympathize with him.
Yeah. It's stupid, but it's better than nothing.
Whoa. So the person that might, how you said, hold the actual key here is actually Jack Ruby. But again, he conveniently died of a pulmonary embolism in 67. And who made the call? So he had this minor role, and I guess they gave him a promotion, right? They gave him a promotion midway. He obviously didn't want to do it, and it's who has the power to? Was it government? Was it mob? Yeah. Was it the Illuminati, Larry? Who was it? Do we have any idea who it could have been?
Well, I have talked to and worked with. We know here's what we do know, we know that the call to this guy in L.A., and by the way, Jack Ruby's explanation and this guy's explanation of what did you talk about the afternoon of the assassination, when the entire country is talking about the killing of the president, this guy and Jack Ruby were talking, ostensibly, according to them, about Jack Ruby's dogs. And the fact that, Jack might be providing. You want to talk code in a conversation? We can talk code in a conversation. You need to take care of your dog. We need your dogs. Anyway, but the bottom line is the connection goes back to, as I said, Johnny Roselli. It goes back to Las Vegas. We have a lawyer who is brought in to defend Jack Ruby, who gets a call after Jack Ruby shoots Oswald. And basically the lawyer says, I knew who was calling. I recognized the voice. And by the way, in the call, they go, all the money that we're going to talk about and this whole defense fund that we're going to talk about has to go through Jack's brother. This has got to be totally deniable. You're going to make a lot of money off this. The guy said, I knew it was Johnny Roselli calling me from Vegas. And we have an FBI surveillance report putting Johnny Roselli in Vegas at the time. That gets to be the conspiracy itself is a combination of people. It's not just one individual. And they have their strengths. Roselli had certain strengths, and he had connections to Dallas and could make things, to do something like the attack in Dallas. You not only need people that are experienced and trained and enough to do that kind of paramilitary attack but you need field work. I mean, that's the way things, you need to set up things. You need to know who can be given minor jobs, how can you get access to information. That's what Jack Ruby was doing up until Oswald got captured. Then it all changed.
They had to be a professional team. Now, this Roselli guy, right, has connections to the CIA. That would make one's mind wander as to who could have been behind this. How proficient was Oswald with a weapon? Because if we're I've seen, I think even did MythBusters do an episode on the shooting, how you had to do like 2 shots in X amount of time, and that it was, I think it was like impossible. I could be completely remembering it wrong, but how proficient was he with weapons, if at all?
Well, 2 things. To make those shots, you had to operate a bolt action rifle. For anybody who's ever followed, that means you got to eject your cell, you got to work your bolt, you got to reseat your shell, even though you've got a clip in the rifle, and you've got to reacquire your target, either through the scope, which the FBI found was not sighted incorrectly. So if he had used the scope, he would have missed. So, okay, let's say he's using the iron sights. He's got to nobody could ever duplicate that. They could get off 6 shots in, or 3 shots in 6 seconds, but not hit the target.
Yeah.
People always go, well, you can take those shots. Yeah, you can take the shots, you can't hit it. The Marines couldn't duplicate it. The FBI couldn't duplicate it. Nobody could duplicate it. But the real story on Oswald is when he went through basic training, infantry training, basically AIT or Marine infantry training, he fired competent. I mean, that's the truth. He's on the range a lot. He's firing competent. That's not a problem. Oswald has shot before. He was a kid, his family talks about going out and hunting. So, not an expert or anything, but he's used a rifle before. He likes guns. Most people in my generation down here, guns were routine. But when he was exiting the Marines and taking his last firing range test, he barely qualified, which just shows you, again, as anybody shooter knows, if you're not practicing, you get worse. You've got to be practicing with that weapon. You've got to have the weapon sighted in. Just to show you how bad this is, and we point this out in the book, when the Warren Commission decided that they had to have a section on Oswald's shooting ability, their advisor from the Justice Department said, do not do that. Nobody's going to believe it. You don't have a case. Leave that whole section out, which they did not. But it's like anybody who really looks at the background there, no, he didn't. He not only did not have those skills, he had not, there was no practice that could be found, for years. When he had been in Russia, he joined a factory shooting team because that was kind of expected. And we know from people that talked with members of the team, he was not a good shot then. Then they laughed at him. He bought a shotgun and went hunting in Russia. And again, they laughed at him because he couldn't hit anything. So there's not really there's a reason why the Justice Department guy said, don't do that. I would throw other thing in for people that are maybe not as familiar as how badly this sort of information was obscured by the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission convened a ballistics panel. These are guys experienced weapons, experienced in wounds, experienced in ballistics, and they gave him supposedly the fatal bullet, the bullet that went both through Kennedy and Connally. and they studied it extensively. And they generated a report that said, no, this bullet doesn't work. This bullet does not do what you said it do. It doesn't support the shooting scenario that you have. It doesn't work. As I recall, there was something like a dozen people on the panel that just said it doesn't work. There was one person that advised the panel who said it worked, Arlen Specter, the guy who had come up with the shooting scenario for that bullet. And basically Specter said, well, I believe it can anyway. And the Warren Commission just took it and hid it in the 26. In fact, I'm not even sure it's in the 26 volumes. It's like, we don't want to see this. This is not going to be part of the story.
Yikes! That's not a good look for the team at all. It seems like Oswald was, and maybe he wasn't. I was going to say he's wrong place, wrong time. No, he was exactly where he needed to be. But it was calculated even before that. How you said earlier, he had a whole different series of events of what was going to go down that day, and that didn't include being framed for the assassination of JFK. Right. So where do we go from here, Larry? I know you leave it open for speculation in the book, and you say towards the beginning of the book he was not this calculated, cold-blooded killer. And towards the end of the book, you kind of say the same thing. We're presenting the information, you go through his life and everything. But what's next? Are we ever going to know the truth, Larry? Is this ever going to come and see the light of day?
Well, after 4 books on the subject, I would say, let's put it this way. I've satisfied myself. I can't claim that it will satisfy anybody else, but I wrote a book called Tipping Point, which deals with the conspiracy and the attack, right? Okay, this is where here's how the conspiracy gelled. Here was the high-level motives, the low-level motives, the kind of people that were involved. That was in a book called Tipping Point. And that was kind of the summary of all the other work that I'd done, my best view of how it had happened and who was involved. But the reason I went on to write this book with David was because it had left Oswald out of the equation. It's kind of like, okay, that's the conspiracy and those are the guys, but what about Oswald? What's going on with Oswald, and how could he be blamed for this? How much of it was coincidence? How much was it framed? And one of the things that is important to remember is if you're going to really patsy someone, it's kind of like a con job. The easiest way to con somebody is to say that you're doing what they want to do. They're trying to make money. You offer them a money-making scheme. You never win at the tables. I got a system. You've got to offer them something that they find is in their agenda, and that's what happened with Oswald. The bad guys really offered him something that fit his agenda, had nothing to do with JFK, but that made him usable. And they started that effort as early as August in New Orleans, when they had first approached him. And there's a whole series of activities that they did with him to convince him that they were on his side and they were going to offer him something that he wanted, which literally was to go to Cuba and join in the Cuban experience, the Cuban Revolution, and maybe even carry, fight Yankee imperialism, carry this on, participate. So they offered him something, and we can describe that. I mean, we actually have documents of him saying that he wanted to do that, trying to go to Cuba, even talking about hijacking an aircraft to go to Cuba. So that's why I to answer your question is, what can we do to solve this? I think to one extent, we're not going to go much beyond that in the conspiracy because it was not investigated. And to the extent that it was investigated, like the report I talked about earlier, when the CIA investigates itself, that's gone. If they found something that implicated some of their people, we're not going to see it. So I don't know that we're going to get better on that. I think that there are some documents that exist in regard to the CIA and Oswald, the FBI and Oswald, that could tell us a lot about what they were doing with Oswald and tell us why it was covered up. So I think we could understand, I think we will be able to understand the cover up more. if we get some of the right documents that we know existed at one point in time, we may be able to uncover a little bit more about the conspiracy because we know what to look for. I will say this, and it's not to, if the people, if the DNI and these teams that are looking at revealing documents don't talk to us, they won't know what they need to get, because it's not just taking what is going to be given to you and releasing it. That's not the point. That would have happened a long time ago. We do know what to look for, and I hope there's several people that could help them. I hope they go that route. But another long-winded answer to your question, I think we have an insight into the actual conspiracy among all the many that there could have been, the actual motive among all the many that there were. And we have a view of Oswald that I think is finally more rational. It's more real regarding Oswald. It doesn't make Oswald a good guy, doesn't make him a bad guy, but it makes him doing his own thing, which is a lot easier to understand.
And I think it's important to look at, because I love history as well. I love everything about it. Some people would say that history has been manipulated, which, I mean, I can't help but agree with them to a certain extent, because, I mean, it's going to happen. How you're saying, if the CIA found something, what's to say that they didn't scrub it behind the scenes and we're never going to know the truth about that. But I love the fact that you took this book and you wrote it from a different perspective, because everyone always focuses, right? JFK, the magic bullet. I've even seen conspiracies, Larry, where it was actually the driver of the limousine or whatever you want to call it that turns around and actually fires back at JFK. I mean, there's been so many different things, and this is a multifaceted conspiracy. And you know, even if you go deeper into the conspiracy, people are like, November 22nd, right? 11/22/33. So it was the Freemasons that, you know, got to JFK, the Illuminati, the mob ties. I've also heard he was going to cut off funding to Israel or something like that. So it was the Zionists or whoever. There's so many things going on. And similar to how we're never going to truly know probably, you know, the origins of life, I don't think we're ever going to truly know the secret of the JF, you know, what actually happened that day. And maybe how you're saying he was promised all these things, would you say he was more of a, I don't want to call him an idiot, but a useful idiot, to where he kind of fell for the plan and like, hey, we got him, because he kind of, there are holes in the whole character of Oswald, right? We can find those in some discrepancies, but he fit the narrative so well. And then on top of him being dead, which we're never going to know, how old would he have been if he survived till this day? He would have been, what, 80 something?
Yeah, 80 something. I think 82, something like that.
He fit the narrative, and then they wipe him out. Jack Ruby croaks, you know, a little bit after that. And then who's left other than the main players, right? It's a game of chess that they're playing. And would you say they got away with it, Larry?
Yeah. Here's the thing, and actually that question makes me feel a little bitter about the whole thing. First of all, you use the term useful idiot, and that's interesting because that doesn't come from us. That comes from a CIA officer. We have an actual quote from a CIA officer who's in this same group that we're talking about, in this Cuban operations group. And his daughter asked him one time, she goes, and she's open about this. She said, well, okay, tell me who killed Kennedy. You know, all right, this is what you talk about at Thanksgiving at the dinner table. Or it's like when your dad's been in the CIA, right? Okay, you should know. You're there. And his response to that was, you don't want to know, which is not a reassuring response. And then she said, well, what about what about Lee Harvey Oswald? And his dad said, he was simply a useful idiot. Now, in CIA terminology, that doesn't mean he was an idiot and not bright. That means that he could be manipulated. We used him unknowingly. He is an idiot in terms of what our agenda is. He's got his agenda. So actually that term useful idiot, I think is a very good descriptor. On your other question and other response, what makes me feel better about it? Okay. if that's possible. One of the people, and I did find a few people who were inside the conspiracy that eventually had heard about it at the time, not later. I mean, at the time, in November 1963. One of them was a young man from Florida, whose father was John Martino, who had been a prisoner inside Cuba, a very anti-Castro, and his dad had talked about what was going to happen to Kennedy when he got to Texas. Okay. And actually, this is on record. Two of his friends, he talked to them both right before his death, and they provided information to the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He didn't know much, and he didn't claim that he knew much, but he knew a couple of things, and he had a very minor role. He was a courier, had gone to New Orleans and Dallas. What he knew was Lee Harvey Oswald was not the shooter, never intended to be a shooter, was not part of the shooting plot. Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be thought that he was going to meet people at the Texas Theater who were going to help him get out of the U.S. and go to Cuba. But that was not going to happen. He was going to be killed with evidence planted on him pointing to Castro and Cuban agents. And Oswald went off the rails. At 12:30, the first part of their plan succeeded. They killed JFK and accomplished what their mission was. Oswald went off the rails. He got concerned. He heard things he wasn't supposed to hear. It was a shock to him that the president had been killed. What's going on? And he gets himself caught. And for them, these people, Martino and his friends, had been told that their action was going to cause the U.S. to invade Cuba and replace Castro. That's why they were in it. That's why they were participating. A big part of it. That didn't happen. Eventually, they reached the conclusion that they had been given a false story. These people had never really intended that to happen. It was just something to help co-opt them and get them to go along. But I guess your question was, did they win? The bad news is they won because they killed JFK. The good news is that they didn't win what they wanted to win. And it does cheer me up to think that, he said his dad was on the phone all afternoon. Everybody was just going out of their minds because things weren't happening that should be happening. And it makes me feel better to know that they were frustrated.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And I'm just wondering, let's say that all this is true, that he wasn't the shooter and that he was actually just this almost a willing participant, almost, right? Where he actually was within the building that he was in, and if he heard the shots that went off and all of that, and what his thoughts and reactions would be, right? And I just wish he would have done more when the cameras were on him to get rid of that narrative, right? To maybe he was taking a little bit LSD, Larry. I mean, who knows, right?
But let's think about this, and this is something David and I got to in the epilogue. It's kind of like, okay, what if? What if Oswald doesn't get shot by Ruby? What's he going to have to say? All right, here's the bad news. There is a rifle traceable to him at the scene of the crime where the shooting occurred. Now, is he going to get off with public opinion being what it was? What's he going to have to say? It's kind of like, well, yes, my rifle, but I didn't put it there. I didn't bring it to work. Oh, who did? Well, I don't know who did. Well, why would they do this to you? I don't know why they would do it to me. This guy's, and they said they were Cuban agents trying to help me. Oh, so your friends are Cuban agents trying to help you? They're pro-Castro, and we're just kind of getting, if he said everything that he knew, that we think he knew,
nobody would have believed him. Yeah.
Nobody would have believed it. He might have just dug himself into a deeper hole.
Yeah, I think you guys say that nobody would have believed him if he would have told the truth anyways to begin with, because they had already taken a hold of the narrative. Larry, just a few more questions here before we start wrapping up. Do you believe maybe there are people still alive till this day that know the truth?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are still they're the ones that do know are in their 80s. Certainly, there's no doubt about that. I don't see any reason that I've actually talked on occasions like, could you persuade somebody to write a note and leave it, with their attorney for after they pass away to tell this story? I don't really expect that's going to happen. I'm led to believe that, they were still proud of what they did. There was, they were acting on their agenda. They were acting to, they had been fighting for years to get rid of Castro and the Cuban regime. So they viewed it as an act of patriotism. And I don't think you're going to see anybody recant an act of patriotism. The ones that would be alive, the CIA officers, seem to be, they're not going to embarrass, if they didn't embarrass the agency before, they're not going to embarrass the agency now. The agency was fighting the Cold War. They won the Cold War. They won the first Cold War at least. They're not going to recant. So I don't really know who it would be. The witnesses, we're not going to hear anything new from the witnesses. So no, I think there are people living. I don't see any of them at risk. I think the thought that the records might somehow, be a risk for them is not realistic. I don't think any of that is true because there's nothing in the records. It wasn't investigated, or when it was investigated, it disappeared. Right?
You think RFK Jr. knows?
No, I think he suspects. I don't think he's heard anything other than what we've discussed. I mean, I know people that know him. I talked to him briefly on a couple of occasions. He might not even remember. I talked to him about the RFK assassination, not JFK. but I know, I think he has the same suspicions from high-level people who heard it. It's kind of like this useful idiot thing. Did he hear from people you would think no, that, but on November the 22nd, we know that Robert Kennedy, Bobby, made 2 telephone calls. The first call was to the director of the CIA to ask him, and Bobby said this, did the CIA kill my brother? Now, the strangest thing is nobody ever asked Bobby, why did you think they would?
Yeah.
What led you? Why is this your first call? Now, McCone told you no, but he's not CIA. He's just the director. Who knows? But why would you think that? The second call was to a friend of his in an anti-Castro group who was working on a new project to launch a new regime change operation against Castro. And he called him and wanted to talk. And he said, literally, your people did it. Nobody asked Bobby why he said that. What did Bobby know? What did Bobby suspect? We know from documents and things that have been revealed that both Bobby and Jackie told the Russians, sent contacts to tell the Russians that they knew it wasn't the Russians. They knew it was a domestic conspiracy, or they suspected it was a domestic conspiracy. One of the documents that we're not going to get is that William Manchester interviewed Jackie and several others, witnesses, about these sorts of things. And because he was writing a book on the assassination, William Manchester, right afterwards. The Kennedy family, Jackie, sealed those records for 75 years as to what she told Manchester. It's not part of the JFK collection. We're not going to get that as any part of. I think that would tell us more. What Jackie and Bobby suspected and why they suspected it would tell us more than any document that we're going to get.
Maybe that's why RFK was taken out, perhaps. I mean, that's just an idea, maybe. I mean,
that has been expressed. I have one of the issues, of course, I was there when RFK was campaigning. I was a big part of on campus and part of what was going on at the time. Even if RFK had not become president, there's no doubt that RFK would have been part of the next administration. And what role is clear? Probably not attorney general again, but he would have had a role. He would have been a big decision maker in any Humphrey administration. And one of the things that you have to look at, I'm not so sure if Robert had wanted to disclose what he knew and raise the roof, he would have done it. I mean, he had the opportunity.
Regardless.
Yeah, he would have done it. What he could have, my particular thing is, I think his role either as a president or, that threatened people outside the jail. It wasn't just about JFK assassination. It was Bobby and his inclination to do things that were kind of like his brothers. It's sort of like he's for the same sorts of things his brother was. Who wouldn't like that? It's not so much just JFK assassination. It's just what administration policies would Bobby and as president or Bobby as a major figure pursue? That's the danger.
I guess we'll never know, Larry, right? I mean, this is a lot of rabbit holes, a lot of, I find it super fascinating, super interesting. And I look at the JFK assassination almost like a thought experiment, right? It makes you think, makes you wonder. We have the mainstream ideas. Man, I'm going to take James Files' word on it. I think maybe he did it. He's a good storyteller, who knows? But Larry, do you have anything planned? I know you've written many books. You've researched this for a lot of years. Do you have any other plans on other books coming out here soon? What can people expect from you?
Now, David and I are still working on some of the aspects of this. Who would have set Harvey Oswald up? How did that really happen? Who traveled with him after New Orleans? We think maybe we can piece some of those things together to really take this to a finer level of detail and kind of like there are certain number of suspects. Could you condense the number a little bit? So we plan to keep working on that. For myself, it has been 35 years. I'm kind of thinking I need another hobby. There's a telescope behind me. Maybe I should take that out again. It's like, I used to go fishing. Was life better before all the history? I love the history just like you. I love it. I don't doubt that I'll ever get away with it, but I keep going, okay, options.
You don't look a day past 30, Larry. You look great. All right. So
I appreciate that.
Keep up the great work. I really appreciate you talking to me today. And if I've learned anything from today's interview is that the aliens did really take JFK out. So I'm going to tell my kids that's what happened. And hopefully they tell their kids that that's what happened as well.
I've got a program for you. Do a search on the Dark Skies television series.
I've heard about that. Is that on Netflix?
Dark Skies is like the perfect thing. It's like Bobby Kennedy investigates his brother's assassinations and finds it all due to the aliens. Like it's the perfect convergence of all these conspiracies. It's great. It's Bobby Kennedy against the aliens for assassinating JFK. So you might want to share that with them. That'll go there.
There's nothing new under the sun. That's for sure.
I know when it first came on television, I'm going, oh, finally. Okay, good. We're done.
Larry, any closing thoughts? You want to let people know where they can find you one more time if anyone hasn't heard of you or anything else you want to plug? And
I just say if people do choose to read the book, I'll be talking about it on the blog. Any of the books that there are 4 books. Someone would have talked. The whole thought was, if there was a conspiracy, would someone talk? And I found a few people that did, but only to their wives and lawyers. Anybody that talks to the public, irrespective of James Files, don't believe them. If they talk to their, near-death confessions are the best kind that you can get. If they did it, don't expect them to go to the media. So someone would have talked. Nexus, which goes into this in regard to CIA assassinations and regime change and what it looks like, and then Tipping Point in this. But if anyone reads those and have any questions, I'm very accessible by email, and I'm happy to chat about it. As you say, we're never going to have exactly the final answer, but I'm happy to discuss the one I found.
I appreciate your time, Larry. Thank you so much again for speaking with me today. Everyone, make sure to check out the Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald. Available Amazon or wherever. Just look up Larry Hancock. He's done a ton of work on the subject. I was very excited to talk to him today because, again, this is something that I haven't really dive down the rabbit hole so much, and it's uncovered a lot of things for me. So happy you were here with me tonight, Larry. Thank you so much. And as always, everyone, make sure to check out the show on social media at the Juan Juan Podcast, www.tjojp.com. Comment, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And as always, we'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye now.